And I see that the chair has reappeared, so I could go on, but I'll stop here because I think we can maybe develop other issues during the Q&A. So I'll stop there. But great paper to read, Tom, if I can finish with that.
Thank you, Justin. I think you've opened up some wonderful themes, perhaps not even just for this session, but also for future Irish-Italian conversations about, for example, an eternity clause or not an eternity clause, and so on. There are some fascinating questions there, none of which are banal, by the way. I'll maybe allow Tom to respond on the particular issue about referendums. Tom is obviously well placed to answer, as is Oran and Rachel, who've worked on amendments. And I would just say that the role of the Irish people in constitutional amendment is not fictitious. It is real, very real. But I'll hand over to Tom to respond to these fascinating questions, and then we can open it out to the floor.
Thanks, Aileen. Thank you, Justin, for first of all for your very nice words, which I appreciate, but also with your 5 or 6 or 7 insights, questions, really helpful. The last one, Aileen, I agree, right? So first of all, I just think, Justin, it's worth bringing your attention to, or for our Italian friends, Article 46, Section 2, I think it is. Sorry, Section 3. A bill containing a proposal or proposals for the amendment of this constitution shall not contain any other proposal. Non-heterogeneous. Okay, so that's something. Not every proposal for amendment to the Constitution has been conspicuous by its clarity, right? But many of them have, and I think Aileen and David in that paper that I've talked about, I think it's a forthcoming book chapter, they talk about that in very interesting ways, that there is this culture that has been, you can't just impose it, where it's hasn't developed, but it has developed over decades, and we're getting better and better and better at that. And I think the abortion referendum actually is probably a very good example of where there was so much expertise really and deliberation around clarity and the need for it. And we got in the end a clear proposal with respect to the amendment to the text of the Constitution. So, I would say, there's so much more in there though, Justin, that you mentioned. Will I go through? Oh, sorry. Is there any? I'm reminded of the abortion information case. Let me think what your question was there. Are there any limits to the amendment procedure? In one sense, no, right? Because there was a famous case in the mid-1990s about this called the abortion information case, which is a little bit complicated and convoluted, but essentially, in summary, a case came before the Supreme Court, referred by the president through a certain procedure to the Supreme Court, after the people had voted yes to approve a right to access information about abortion. Okay, it's a bit complicated. And the Supreme Court judges were faced with a kind of a conundrum, because the argument for the prosecution was, well, this amendment will contravene the right to life of the unborn. And there's a right to life in the Constitution. And you yourselves, the judges, had previously said in the 60s that natural law was superior to the Constitution, right? So now it all came home to roost. And the judges were faced with kind of having to, disavow what they had previously said, if you like. And that's kind of effectively what they did. And in other words, they said, look, the people are supreme, right? Natural law can't block the will of the people expressed through the referendum. So I think that's the big case on that particular point. In this state, and Aileen, for instance, has written about that case as it happens. But okay, well, stop me, Aileen, if I should. I'd love to go through them all, of course, but I don't want to.
Well, could I just hop in there for a second, Tom? Just because Justin's question was so fascinating on this. And maybe this may be for more detailed conversation another time. But just to say that there is no eternity clause in the Irish Constitution, but it can be argued that there are some implicit limits. And in reading Professor Toniatti's paper, he referred to the fundamental principles of the constitutional order in Italy. And so there is something analogous that can be argued in the Irish context. So there's no formal eternity clause, but there is an argument to be made that the written constitution is based on fundamental principles, some of which are relatively immune to change, I think, or immune to change. Yeah. So that's a debate, if you like, in the Irish Constitution. So I wonder, Tom, if maybe you would like to pick up on this issue about legitimacy pact, because it was central to your paper, but Justin honed in on this, and I think it would be a good point to open up for discussion. And for any listeners, by the way, if you want to put a question in the Q&A, please do so.
Yeah, like, thanks, Aileen. You know, it's an interesting one. One of Justin's first questions was clarification. Am I saying that Norris was unjust, but it was legitimate? And I guess I am. You know, I guess I'm certainly saying it was unjust. And I guess it came through a legitimate process in the sense that, well, the Parliament was entitled to enact the law, I guess, strictly speaking, legal legitimacy, and the court had the authority it had in virtue of Article 34 of the Constitution. So from a strict legal procedural sense of legitimacy, I suppose, yes, I'm saying it was unjust, but legitimate. I'm really interested in this paper, I guess, not so much in legal legitimacy, but in legitimacy in a kind of a political moral sense. And I suppose I'm gesturing at that notion, all right, that it is not illegitimate even in that sense. But I think that, in fact, Frank Michelman says this in his paper, like, when we think of legitimacy in the political moral sense, I think we can only assess the regime overall, as distinct from assessing particular laws. So I think what Michelman says in the paper is, well, let's just leave that to one side and play around with the idea with reference to, he uses school vouchers, another case, but yeah, so I don't know if that sheds any light on that. So, you know, I'm qualifying my suggestion that Norris was legitimate. Sorry, final point on it. At least, I suppose, you know, I can say back over the fence to Dave, you know, okay, it's unjust, but you can do something about it. You know, in our democratic constitutional system, you can, from the bottom up, you can do something about it, and you should. And this ties back in with the kind of something that Philip Pettit says in his book on the people's terms. You know, if you had to choose or could choose between a state that does really, really well on justice terms, but really badly on legitimacy terms, or the opposite, a state that did really, really well on legitimacy terms, but really badly on justice terms, I think that if you ask that question to the people, like, just without any deliberation, they'd say, I want to do justice is the most important thing. You know, where the Republican or Pettit would say, I would choose the legitimacy state, because then it might be unjust, but at least I can do something about it. Whereas if it's the other way around, I can enjoy the justice, but only so long as the power wielder is inclined to allow me to. So.
Right. Thanks, Tom. I see a lot of hands up now, and I'm going to take them in the order in which they appear to me, and I hope that is fair and legitimate. So that means I'll start with Oran, go on to Roberto, and then Roberto Toniatti, and then go on to Rachel. So Oran first.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for a wonderful paper. I should be spotlighting myself so people can see me too in all my glory.
Yeah, that'll be good. Yeah, good.
I'll remember to do this for other people. Yeah, so Tom, thanks for the paper, and also Justin for the comments on it. Can I ask sort of two slightly provocative questions of you, Tom, just to push you a bit? And one of them has a sort of intended ricochet back to Roberto Toniatti's paper. So if he wants to pick up on it, he's welcome to. The first question is, in terms of your focus on the Irish amendment procedure, are you putting any weight on the form of the procedure, the fact that it involves a referendum, or is all the weight on where I would disagree with Aileen, the unlimited amending power that the Constitution confers? So would you be less inclined to think it was a Republican if it was amendment by a supermajority within Parliament, for example?
Say the last bit again, Oran, sorry.
Would you be, so as I understand it, you cite the amendment procedure as evidence of the Republican character of the Irish Constitution.
Yeah.
Would it be less good evidence of that if the amendment procedure, while still unlimited, gave the power to a supermajority in Parliament rather than the two houses of Parliament and referendum?
Okay.
That's the first question. The second one is, hypothetically, imagine Article 2 of the Constitution said, Ireland is a republic, this provision is unamendable. Would that make Ireland not a republic?
Yes.
And by extension, I'm sort of wondering, is the Italian Constitution not a Republican Constitution because it makes its Republican character unamendable? So that's the ricochet to Professor Toniatti. I don't think the question is a problem for Professor Toniatti, but it might. Thank you.
Thanks, Oran. Great questions. Given the ricochet effect, maybe it would be appropriate to bring in Roberto Toniatti now for your question, Roberto, but also if you wish to engage with this point as well.
Well, I have three very quick questions, and I think I'm using all my time for asking them. The first is, Tom, you make wide references to Rawls, occasionally to other thinkers. I wonder, for a common law lawyer, is Hans Kelsen a reference at all?
Well, not for this common law lawyer, I must admit.
Well, I thought so. I just wanted to make sure.
I must say it's a gap in my knowledge, to be honest. You know, I studied him as an undergraduate and probably as a postgraduate too, but I haven't taught him and I haven't engaged. Now, that wouldn't be I'd say that lots of the positivists here would have. You know, I think Oran would have, for instance. I don't know if it's fair to call you a positivist, Oran, but I just haven't, as it happens, Roberto. But sorry, I interrupt.
No, I'm glad you said no, because in Kelsen's view, there would be no distinction between legitimacy and justice, because whatever the state declares is just, and is not only legitimate. But anyway, that was really out of my own curiosity. At the same time, I find that common law lawyers' reliance on Rawls is not exaggerated, but indeed very, very wide. Yeah. It seems that Rawls is a sort of legal Bible, and unless you quote Rawls, you're not happy. But let me come to two questions. The first, as I said, was just out of curiosity. First of all, I'm very interested in your reference to authorship, to King's theory, and in particular, authorship. And my question is, would you think that authorship might be referred to a generation?
Yeah.
Because so in a way, constitutional sovereignty belongs to a generation, and any generation later is entitled to change entirely the constitution. Now, let me make just a quick reference. I don't remember whether it is Ohio or Illinois, but one of them has a mandatory referendum every 10 years. And the issue is, do you people of Ohio want to change the constitution? And in that case, a constitutional convention is called, and then they proceed. Now, this might be a procedure which is strictly connected to the idea of a generational constitutional sovereignty. The second question, again, very quickly, the eternity clause is assisting in elaborating the concept of constitutional identity in front of the supremacy of the law of the European Union. Of course, constitutional identity is not necessarily limited to the clause, but as I suggested for Italy, and Aileen seems to suggest for Ireland as well, the issue is there. So what elements would contribute to elaborating the concept of constitutional identity of Ireland in front of the primacy of EU law? That's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you.
Maybe I could take Rachel's question and then come back to you, Tom, and there might be another round then. I think there's especially if Rachel's question is related.
Yeah, I think it is, Aileen. Yeah. So Tom, I was just going to pick up. I really enjoyed the paper. 2 points around, I suppose, the emphasis on what we can say about our broader constitutional culture, I suppose, and legitimacy in that respect, based on amendment. And 2 questions. The first is there a difficulty in that in our system, there's no power with the people to initiate a referendum of any sort. That's entirely within the realm of representative politics. So is that gap a difficulty? And the second is, I suppose, to push you a little bit on the idea, and this comes back to Aileen and David's paper. I suppose I'm skeptical about how much the Citizens' Assembly model has penetrated the broader public consciousness. Yeah. And I'm skeptical about whether it is true to say that the wider population has an expectation of an expectation of this kind of process as a prelude to any referendum. I suspect some of them would cast it aside as a waste of time and money. Some of them would think it was wonderful, and some people would have absolutely nothing to say or think about it whatsoever. So I'm just wondering whether, you know, and I'm a supporter of the process, and I think it is a useful contribution to a broader project of opening up discourse about constitutional issues within the wider community, but I don't know whether we can go that far. It's just what I'd suggest.
Yeah.
Great. So Tom, that's quite a lot on your plate there, but let me just draw a connection there between Rachel's last point and Oran's first point, which was really getting at the idea of direct democracy versus representative democracy, if you like, or at least mediated through representation. And how that squares with republicanism. But that's just a potential shortcut. But I'll leave it up to you, Tom, to choose which issues you want to engage.
Yeah, well, look, it's really great to get such interesting questions, I must say, and thank you so much. I won't be able to, and I must say, when I hear them, you know, of course, I relate to all of them, and I can't help but agree with the suggestions behind them, to be honest. And maybe it's because the argument is at such an abstract level, you know, that I can maybe fend them off a little bit, but I'm not trying to fend them off out of a sense of defense. It's more that you can make all of these arguments on both sides, I think, and, you know, Republican theory is not going to give you definitively a position either way. I think, so that's my overriding answer, I think, to nearly all of them. For instance, Oran, seeing as he started, like, is the supermajority in Parliament, is the referendum, the fact of the referendum, what's the word I'm trying to think of, a deal breaker from a Republican perspective? And I think the answer is no, it's not a deal breaker. You know, I suppose, Oran, I happen to really like, now I know we've had a good experience in this country in the last 10 years, and it might not always be like that, and we haven't always had. You know, but I do think that Jeff King's paper is really good, the democratic case for the written constitution. In retrospect, I think maybe I tried to shoehorn it into my paper a little bit, and it kind of maybe it confuses things a little bit, but he seems to plump for the Irish option, because the Irish model, something like it, because that referendum part of it facilitates the national conversation, that Linda Colley notion of the people getting a chance to think about their constitution, which you wouldn't have with the supermajority. So I think it's probably just me expressing my sense of a preference rather than what Republican theory would require, but yes, I would say. And the other thing then is, that was a good one and a funny one, Article 2, Eternity Clause, Ireland is a republic and that shall not be amended. Is that un-Republican? Look, again, I don't think it's a deal breaker. I mean, I like the fact, maybe it's because of complacency, and I come from a country with the history that we haven't had the history that Italy has or Germany has had, for instance. That there are no eternity clauses. I like what that says symbolically, like about this notion that democracy and constitutionalism are neither of them comes before the other. Neither is antecedent. Whereas to me, the notion of eternity clauses suggests that constitutionalism is antecedent, and I just find that problematic, you know. So of course not, it would not be a deal breaker, Oran, right? And you could say at the end of it that like democracy is where the spade turns. Like once you vote away your democracy, it's no longer a democracy. So and what's the practical effect though, Oran, as well of an Article 2 that says that? I mean, what practical impact would the judges? I suppose it would be an interpretive provision to interpret other clauses, but anyway. Rawls and the legal Bible, you know, that's funny, Roberto, and I guilty as charged a little bit. Now, the only thing I would say is, I think Rawls is kind of not, there's a lot of skepticism about Rawls among common lawyers in the UK, for instance, right? All the Judicial Power Project people and the so-called political constitutionalists, they say Rawls is the liberal elitist kind of enemy. And I have to say that I would have had a great deal of sympathy for that view for a long time. And I actually came to read John. You see, that's the thing. You spend so many years reading what other people are saying about John Rawls, you know. And in the last 6 months, I read a lot of John Rawls again, and I think he's caricatured a lot. If you read Reply to Habermas, for instance, if you which was written in around 96 or 5, or if you read Introduction to the Paperback Edition, which was around 97 or thereabouts, and there's another one as well, the Revisited, like you see lots of shifts in Rawls away from the original position with Veil of Ignorance and all that. Such an attractive model and idea, but when you break it down, it seems anything but political or democratic. It's rather kind of pre-political. And we see that kind of replaced or falling away a little bit in the late Rawls, where reciprocity becomes the linchpin rather than original position. And to me, that is Republican. I'm suggesting it's a kind of a Republican twist on it. I'm looking forward to actually putting that to Philip Pettit. I haven't put it to him, but he has written, not disparagingly, but like he does not see Rawls as a Republican, you know. He buys into that, as it were, I'm suggesting maybe caricature of Rawls. King on authorship and generational, yeah, really like that. Like Jeff King in that paper comes to the conclusion in a footnote that I think he says every 20 to 40 years, or is it every 15 to 20? And he makes the point, in fairness, he says, look, you can argue backwards and forwards all day long about what the appropriate duration of a constitution is, and you never agree on an answer. You know, like 15 or 20 years strikes me as incredibly short, even 20 to 40, but I like our constitution a lot, you know, and perhaps that's influencing my thinking on it. So what I would say is, like, I mean, the next decade or 2 decades ahead is interesting in Ireland, and, you know, lots of people on here are writing about unification and so on. Like, I mean, this constitution just wouldn't cut the mustard from a legitimacy standpoint for the British people on our island, right? So, I mean, that affords an opportunity, right? And I think it's inevitable, if that happens, that we would have a new constitution. It's just, I would like to think that structurally we wouldn't depart that terribly far from what we have in this bundle, as it were. And Rachael, yeah, I loved Aileen's paper and David's paper, right? I like it a lot and I recommend it, but it is very optimistic, I think, you know, about citizen assemblies. And to be fair, I think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done, empirical work. And I think the political scientists might be doing it, David Farrell, Jane Souter and so on, about what the public really think, you know. And you Aileen and David worked off exit polls there and like in a comprehensive way. But I have that sense too that Rachael has, you know. Do the public really know? I don't know. Oran and Rachael now have written about that too, and would have a lot more to say about that than I would have. There you go. And the no power to initiate. I'm thinking of Article 27, Rachael. I've forgotten what it says because it's basically a dead letter. But Article 27 says the signatures, doesn't it? 30,000 signatures. Do the people have no power to initiate?
Yeah, I think you're probably right, but I suppose never been used.
Never been used.
No sense that it would ever be. I suppose, and there another question is why, but yeah.
Well, that's it. Yeah, is a design flaw.
Yeah. And maybe could I come in there, Tom, just because you mentioned the paper, and I should say that when David, Kenny and I were writing it, if there's an accusation of optimism, it should be laid at my door, I think, more than David's. But just to say, and I'll have to double check whether we made the claim that there's an assumption of a citizens' assembly. My understanding was that there may be a sense amongst the political elites that this is something that may be done. It's becoming quite recurrent. But yeah, I mean, certainly for me, and to clarify for the Italian audience, you know, I've lived outside of Ireland, worked in the United Kingdom for many years, and then maybe I have the optimism of someone who returns to Ireland. But you see, I experienced the Irish referenda on abortion and same-sex marriage almost contemporaneously with the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. And if you compare those, and you think of the sweep of populism across the world, and Professor Toniatti referred to this as well in Italy and in other countries, that global comparator, I think, sheds a very positive light on the Irish experience, and particularly in terms of legitimacy. There is a sense of social legitimacy of the outcomes of these referendums. One referendum I was tangentially involved in was the divorce referendum. I can't remember what year, but that came down to a couple of hundred votes. It was almost 50-50. And the day after that referendum result came out, it was accepted. People accepted it. People didn't challenge it as illegitimate, as they did in the Brexit referendum for lots of legitimate reasons. So that's just by way.
Yeah, I think it's well articulated, actually, Aileen, and it came across to me. It's that distinction is Brexit is obviously in the background of that paper hugely, and you make in that paper lots of arguments having to do with the structure of the Irish constitutional framework. You know, some of that, for instance, that provision that I mentioned just in response to your question about the one, it's just got to be, you know, it encourages the political elites to give us one little chunk to decide upon. The fact that it has to be an amendment to the text of a constitution and not this kind of, you know, general political moral question and so on. So I think there's lots of really good points along those lines in that paper, Aileen.
Thanks, Tom. And just a point in response to Roberto Toniatti's point about the generational referendum. And if anybody else has any questions, please raise your hand. I know we're in the last few minutes, but if anybody has a question, please do so. But Roberto, I was very interested in your idea of this, you know, every 10 years, a referendum on the entire constitutional project. I find this idea very problematic. You know, can it even be thought of as a stable constitution if that is the case? What I would say in Ireland is that there is a distinct generational dimension here, because, say, for example, on the issue of abortion, in Ireland, there were consecutive referenda on abortion, each of which captured not the complete, but captured something of the generational understanding at that time. And then it was revisited in a subsequent referendum, not in a couple of years, but with the lapse of maybe 15 to 20 years. And so I think in Ireland, people do feel that there is a role for that generation to have an input in the constitutional conversation. I would also say that in relation to gay marriage, and Justin wants to come in, that what was highly significant about it was that the vote in favor of same-sex marriage or marriage equality was cross-generational. The vote for yes spanned across. It wasn't the young people saying yes and the old people saying no. A vast majority covering wide demographics said yes. Justin.
It was just to butt into this issue on the referendum. I couldn't agree with you more about Brexit. Brexit has been terribly divisive. I think because of the result as well, because it was so close and because Brexit won. Wasn't completely a surprise for me. I've written on this, but that's another kettle of fish. My question to you would be, I mean, it's just counterfactual, but was the 1995 referendum on divorce accepted? Because although it was very close, the result was to abolish the prohibition on divorce. Would it have been accepted in the same way if it had gone in?
Yeah. Well, but just I'll come just briefly, but then Tom would probably or Rachel or Oran would have broader views on this. I do think that in Ireland, the referendum process is perceived to be legitimate, and therefore it is content independent. That sense of legitimacy cuts across the issues. And so I mentioned divorce because I think it was so close. It was closer than the Brexit referendum, and yet people accepted it as legitimate because there was a sense that the process was fair. And with marriage equality, with abortion, people disagree so deeply and viscerally, religiously and morally on these issues. And yet on all sides, it was accepted. So I think of it as content independent. And in each of these referendums, there are a lot of people who feel they have lost deeply. It's not that they say, oh, well, maybe divorce is okay. They deeply believe that divorce is not okay, but yet they accept the decision that it's going to be legalized. But maybe Oran, Tom, or anyone would want to get in on this. And I'm conscious now that we're unfortunately entering the last few minutes, but maybe Tom, you wanted to get in.
I agree with you what you've said, Aileen, and I don't think I'll waste any time. Oran, did you want to come in?
I was just going to, that we do need to qualify that with the fact that the divorce referendum was challenged by the anti-divorce campaigners who alleged that the Supreme Court had held that the government had unlawfully spent money on it. And the divorce campaigners challenged that and argued that it was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court basically elaborated an unmeetable test as to which they would have to show that there was a material effect on how the vote came out, but you couldn't ask anybody how they voted, and opinion poll evidence wasn't relevant in the court's view. So I think you're right that there was broader political acceptance, but not immediate acceptance from the losing side. And certainly then later we do see the same-sex marriage referendum was challenged in court. The abortion referendum was challenged in court. In this case, like very much challenges that were destined to fail. And these weren't at this point challenges being led by the leading figures on both campaigns. So I think you're right that there is broad acceptance and nothing like the level of resistance that we see to Brexit. Where that comes from is another question. I just wanted to qualify it slightly.
Great, thanks, Oran. Justin, do you still have your hand up, or is it an old hand? Right. So I think we've come to a point where I think it would be great to talk for longer, but I'm conscious that it has been a long session already, especially for the speakers and for the commentators. And I'd just like to thank everyone, the Devolution Club, for the umbrella organization, to Oran for the impeccable organization of this webinar, and especially to our speakers, Professor Toniatti and Hickey, for fascinating papers that, were papers we could rally around and discuss and share views. It's been really enlightening, and I'm very much looking forward to the next Italian-Irish conversation. And I dare to hope that it would be in person. So I'll just hand back to Oran if you would like to make some